If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network. Many Mexican people arriving in the United States were often ridiculed and discriminated against even by their own people that were Americanized. This is something that happened in Pilsen back in these days. Mexican youths and laborers were often bullied and robbed of the cash they carried by neighborhood gangs after they had labored all day. Eventually some of these Mexican youths on the block of 17th and Racine grew tired of being harassed. Especially by gangs like the Latin Counts, Bishops, Latin Brother, Stoneheads, Party Masters, Tokers and Latin Kings. The youths got together under the direction of Macabrio Ruben and Bones. The name La Raza was chosen along with the Mexican flag colors because La Raza was showing their pride of the country they came from and were ready to fight for those colors and name to the death. The rival gangs in the neighborhood were upset with the name and tried to take it from them, but were met with fierce resistance from the La Raza gang. La Raza tried to avoid gang activity in the early 80s and just tried to be a hangout group that protected each other, but rivals continued to harass them and La Raza had to fight back. La Raza youths tried to remain mostly law-abiding kids that hung out in Dvorak Park by Cullerton and Racine, but even playing in that park brought them harassment from the gangs fighting over that territory. In the year 1981, the fights with neighborhood gangs got worse for La Raza, and they made the decision to join the Folk Alliance alongside their closest allies the Party People. Just like the Party People, La Raza joined the Folk Alliance under the sponsorship of the Little Village 2-6s, but La Raza did not adopt the moniker of gangster like the Party People did. Instead La Raza adopted Insane, which was the moniker that the Satan disciples used, but La Raza had no direct ties to the SDs, except for being folks too. La Raza and Party People were close allies, since they both started in the same year of 1980 as Party Cruz. Both groups also consisted of mainly Mexican youths fresh from Mexico that were struggling with gangs in the neighborhood, trying to take advantage of them. There may have been a friendship with the Brazers too as they were going through the same thing, however, La Raza was not born out of the Brazers as many think. There were also stories that La Raza was born out of the Party People. This isn't true either. Many other stories try to claim La Raza was born out of other various groups, but those are not true either. Many just seem to have a hard time grasping that La Raza started independently and have always been lone wolves that sometimes have allies. Many seem to want to believe La Raza was once owned by other gangs upon their inception, but this isn't true. La Raza is all original. In the year 1982, a younger group of La Raza started up called Tiny Raza that was situated by 21st and Throop. This was the slow progression of how La Raza was becoming more and more known in the neighborhood as they were now growing. Things got real serious in 1982 when the gang's first ever member Martin was gunned down. This is when La Raza began to gravitate more into being a gang-banging crew than ever. After the killings of Mando and Snake, then in 1984 Macabrio was killed by Racine Street Latin Counts. This made La Raza more into a hardcore gang-banging crew, as now they were targets by rivals more so than ever. In the year 1985, La Raza expanded into new territory in the back of the yards community. Beto was the founder of the 48th Street La Raza branch as he connected with a gang called the 48th Street Boys that made a lot of noise in the early 1980s. This section was started at 48th and Laughlin. La Raza was always hard for law enforcement and the general public to identify because of their name and colors. Anybody who is Mexican can wave the Mexican flag and say they are La Raza, which means the race in Spanish. If Chicago police were to harass someone based upon them claiming they are La Raza and wearing the Mexican flag colors and emblems, they could be accused of violating the civil rights of that individual. This is how the La Raza gang blended in until the late 1980s. By the mid-1980s, everyone was starting to hear about La Raza as they became more violent in their gang banging, as now members were beginning to drop rival gang members as well. Since many of these older members didn't have too many ties to the United States, they could just pack up and leave for Mexico after committing a murder. In the year 1988 La Raza went to war with Ambrose along 18th Street. In March of that year, some Ambrose members jumped a member of La Raza and according to court documents La Raza gang members Martin Quiroz and Jose Anaya shot and killed Ambrose gang member Jesus Sanchez. In that same year of 1988, La Raza and the Satan disciples went to war. This was mainly because La Raza was still allied to the 2-6s and 2-6s had just launched into full-scale war with Satan disciples. At Cullerton and Loomis, La Raza was always in very close proximity to allies the 2-2 boys, and now that 2-6 and 2-2 boys were at war, and La Raza was still allied with 2-6, a war erupted with the 2-2 boys. In the late 1980s, Raza aggressive measures grew as they continued to be implicated in more and more shootings. Raza would often deal with their enemies quickly without any hesitation, giving them the reputation as one of the more violent street gangs in the Pilsen area and perhaps on the top list for the city. This gained them much notoriety and brought them more expansion in Pilsen, and now they progressed to growing into other neighborhoods, especially the back of the yard neighborhood between 47th and 49th Street from Ashland down to Racine, 48th side. Raza also grew into a large area in Pilsen between 19th Street and 21st Street and Loomis to Racine. At this point they likely closed 17th Street to focus more on the 19th Street zone. At some point in time Raza also opened up 50th and Hoyne in 42 Road and Mozart in Kelly Park in the Brighton Park neighborhood. Raza also spread into the Marquette Park neighborhood at 61st and Fairfield and 76th and Ridgeway in the Ashburn neighborhood. Raza even wandered into the north side and opened territory at Clark and Estes North Pole in the Rogers Park neighborhood. Raza also made their way into the Hermosa neighborhood on Chicago's northwest side at Harding and Wabancha DK Town, which became a flourishing section that spread to Cortland and Kedvale. In the earlier 1990s Raza would pioneer the suburbs of Streamwood, Rockford, Carpentersville and Cicero at 14th and 49th in the Grant Work section. By 1990, the war with Ambrose died out and would not resume until the mid-1990s. In Cicero by the early 1990s, the two boys originally were on the corner of 14th and 49th, and now over a decade later, Raza was settling there. This kicked off a major gang war, as these two gangs were just too close to each other. Raza also began to be at odds with the Satan Disciples, and all-out war began in 1988 as well. Throughout the 1990s, Raza fought several vicious and bloody gang wars, yet they continued to multiply in size and seemed to become increasingly violent. Raza remained close allies with 2-6 until a territorial dispute happened in 1998 over 42nd and Mozart, which was in 2-6 territory, and Raza was taking from their drug business. Raza did not want to give up the territory, so they both went to war for about a year. Then a truce was called because both gangs were having issues with the Saints, and Raza left that territory and put more soldiers on 48th Street for investment reasons and to keep relations with 2-6. 2-6 eventually left 61st and Fairfield, closing down their Marquette Park operations for reasons I did not know. Cortland and Kedvale was eventually left behind for more investment at Harding and Wabancha. Raza has not lost much territory over the years and only lost one suburban investment in Carpentersville because of the police. The organization has ran strong since 1972 and is known for being one of the more vicious, aggressive and violent organizations. The story of the Harrison Gents begins in the year 1957, when a group of Rican, Irish and African American boys from Harrison and Western in the near West Side neighborhood were forced to protect their neighborhood from invading gangs like the Egyptian Cobras, Taylor Street Dukes, Clovers and Imperial Chaplains. The gangs were hungry for dominance and wanted to take over this main intersection. These kids at this intersection were good kids that were well-mannered and especially were respectful to women of all ages. Basically, they were well-behaved gentlemen. The problem was they were also bullied and attacked by gangs, which drove them to fight almost every day. In the year 1959, the boys decided it was time to organize into a gang, and they had no choice due to constant invasions. They decided on the name Harrison Gents because they were from Harrison Street, and the Gents part came from the fact they were gentlemen to women. They chose the color purple because it was a popular zoot suit color back then. The HGs began congregating just down the block at Claremont Playlot, located at 2334 Watts. Flournoy Street, Flournoy and Western, this is where they congregated and swelled in numbers in the 1960s. The HGs eventually advanced east down to Damon Avenue and encompassed Damon Avenue to Western Avenue and Harrison Street to Flournoy. This was all just about 2 blocks away from the Taylor Street gangs and not far from the Vice Lords of North Lawndale. In the year 1964, some Rican members of the Harrison Gents migrated to the East Village neighborhood at Ashland and Beach, and this put them into direct conflict with the Latin Kings that were arriving at the same time at Ashland and Cortez during the Great Puerto Rican migration to West Town area. The Gents that arrived here also slugged it out viciously with the PVPs that became one of their arch-enemies. Ashland and Beach was the first section that came right after Harrison and Western. In the year 1964, the Harrison Gents arrived in the Uptown neighborhood at the intersection of Kenmore and Ainsley when Puerto Ricans and African American were first migrating there. This was also the first time the Gents recruited white members into the gang. Another gang that settled 1 block away was the Latin Kings. Right away the Gents and Kings were met by the Young Lords and Latin Eagle street gangs from the nearby Lakeview neighborhood. Immediate gang brawls were breaking out between the four gangs. Latin Eagles and Young Lords were allies and teamed up on Kings and Gents, therefore Latin Kings and Harrison Gents became very close allies. In the midst of the war between Harrison Gents and Latin Eagles, the Latin Eagles killed the leader of the Gents, which angered the Gents. However, they did not get revenge until 1975, when they burned down the house of a Latin Eagle gang member near the intersection of Fremont and Addison, in the Wrigleyville section of the Lakeview neighborhood. A 13-year-old girl was killed in the fire, while members of the Harrison Gents were arrested. The Harrison Gents then would spread their influence into the Wicker Park neighborhood sometime in the 1960s into the Blackhawk Park area at the intersection of Ashland Avenue and Division. In this area the HGs were fighting with the Spanish Lords and some other gangs. In the year 1968, the Harrison Gents found common ground with the Ashland Vikings because of their mutual hatred for Latin Kings and PvP. This was the beginning of a very close alliance between the two gangs. The Harrison Gents would soon gain more popularity because of their ruthless ways and making the newspaper. On June 24, 1969, several members of the Harrison Gents paid a visit to the Lathrop projects on Clybourn Avenue to start problems with the Young Lords that were living there. The exact address this was happening was at 2852 Clybourn Avenue, which is near the intersection of Clybourn and George in the North Center neighborhood. The Young Lords were an activist group by 1969 and were no longer all about the gang banging, but the Harrison Gents had ticked them off and got them to fight. The fight was nasty and heated, and the Gents were likely getting the better of the Young Lords, because when the police arrived and tried to stop it, a few officers were accidentally struck by HGs that had tunnel vision in bashing anyone in sight. The Gents tried to play nice and help the officers after hitting them, but the cops still turned around and arrested them. As the later 1960s came and the Harrison Gents expanded to the intersection of Sheridan and Leland in the Uptown neighborhood, HG numbers swelled into the hundreds between the Harrison and Western section, Wicker Park and Uptown sections. Eventually the Gents spread to Augusta and Paulina, Hermitage and Cortez, Chicago Avenue and Hermitage, Chicago Avenue and Wood and Rice and Wood, covering all over Noble Square and East Village. In the early 1970s, the Harrison Gents of West Town absorbed both Mighty Grand of Ashland and Grand Avenue and the Lazy Gents, converting them all into Harrison Gents. In the year 1979, bad blood developed between the Harrison Gents and Latin Kings in Uptown. Conflicts led to the Latin Kings killing a Harrison Gent that year, and full-fledged war began. Now the Gents from Uptown were joining their fellow Gents from West Town in a war against the Latin Kings. One of the main reasons the Gents didn't join folks in 1978 was because of the Uptown alliance with the Latin Kings, but after this incident they were open to joining folks, and in 1980, when the folk alliance opened to new gangs, the Gents got in right away. Many Harrison Gents were incarcerated by 1980, so they were approached to join the Spanish Gangster Disciple Alliance behind bars, which earned them a folk alliance offering. In the year 1981, the Harrison Gents were now folks on the streets after it was now spread to the streets that year. When the HGs joined folks, they were able to ally up tightly with fellow folks like the Insane Dragons and open territory at Augusta and Fairfield in the East Humboldt Park neighborhood. Also, in 1980 the older HGs out of Cortez and Ashland under David and an independent group of Cobras were actively hanging out with the Vikings. In that same year the V's hooked up with Erie House at 1347 West Erie Street. They were trying to form a graffiti cleanup campaign with the West Town gangs. From there, Puncher and CM, an old-school LD running a section out of the Huron and Ada territories, established a gang truce that would include the AVs, the LDs, La Familia and the TPs. Upset with an article where the YLOs tried to claim the alliance under their flag, the V's and the D's pull in the HGs and start running under their own banner, UPCI, United Patriots Creating Identity, and also wanted to run the Truce Alliance under its own flag. But Erie House wanted a name better suited to the community so that they could open lines into the Department of Neighborhoods. So as a compromise they kept the initials UPCI and added the name United People for Community Improvement. Keeping the initials UPCI allowed the older leaders to keep United Patriots Creating Identity in the streets as the true umbrella over the Gang Truce Coalition, hence the AKA and the UPCI cards. Over the next couple of months the UPCI would also include the Satan Disciples, a young section of HGs out of Bosworth and Blackhawk, a group out of Eckhart Park going under the Neutrals, who although refused to be labeled a gang, could hold their own when they had to, and periodically the involvement of some Cobras and BGDs, who were affiliated with the Vikings and LDs. Erie House started dealing directly with CM and Puncher and allowed them meetings in Erie House with the other gangs when needed. The anti-graffiti campaign was successful and led to a celebration event on the Eckhart Park field grounds in Noble Square. But it was the V's who continued to launch other projects for the communities, such as replacing vaulted sidewalks, cleaning vacant lots, coordinating food and clothes drives for the shelters, and helping Peabody School, 1444 West Augusta, on a closed campus for the kids. As a result, the Vikings got mentioned on the nightly news twice and appeared alongside Erie House on a talk show called Common Ground. In 1980, the Harrison Gents ended up taking Ashland and Cortez from the Latin Kings. In the early 1980s, the Harrison Gents took over the 412 watts Chicago Avenue, 41 Deuce building in the Cabrini Green public housing projects. The HGs were close allies with the Black Gangster Disciples, therefore, they only had to fight it out with Mickey Cobras and the Vice Lords. Vice Lords didn't have much territory in Cabrini Green. In the year 1986, feuds began between Harrison Gents and Ashland Vikings, as a young group of Harrison Gents from Black Hawk and Paulina area were mixing it up with Vikings. This resulted in war between Vikings and these Gents. The war was not backed by the older Gents from all other sections of the city, but was the start of later conflicts between Gents and Vikings. By the year 1992, the United Latino Organization Alliance was broken up as Spanish Cobras and Latin Disciples, and the Maniac Latin Disciples went to war. There were now 3 alliances that Latin folks gangs had to choose from up north: the Maniacs with the Maniac Latin Disciples, the Insanes with the Spanish Cobras, or the Almighties with the Imperial Gangsters and Latin Eagles. The Gents chose to align with the Spanish Cobras, and they became the Insane Harrison Gents. It was about this time that the Gents settled in the suburbs of Kankakee and Cicero at 25th and Central Avenue. It was just a matter of time before the Harrison Gents and the Ashland Vikings were going to explode on each other, and in 1995 war erupted once again, which prompted the Harrison Gents to withdraw from the Insane family and join the Almighty family, becoming the Almighty Harrison Gents. The conflicts that began in 1986 worsened after the Familias were formed, and now the older Gents were backing up the Black Hawk and Paulina area Gents, and permanent bloody war was settled between Gents and Vikings. The war got really bad when the Harrison Gents gunned down Lord Cisco from the Vikings, then the V's got revenge by gunning down Benji G from the Harrison Gents. The Harrison Gents would eventually lose their Uptown and Wicker Park turfs due to gentrification. They also lost their satellite locations in East Humboldt Park and Albany Park due to more need in their East Village and Noble Square operations. The Cicero chapter would also eventually close down. East Village and Noble Square would live on. The Harrison Gents would remain at Harrison and Western until the area was dramatically changed due to gentrification in the 2000s. The Brazer's story starts in the 70s, on the southwest side of Chicago, at the intersection of 19th and Marshfield, in the heart of Chicago section of the Lower West Side. They were better known as Los Braceros when they formed. The Brazer name didn't come until later. The Brazers consisted of Central American youths and Mexican youths that migrated to Chicago mostly illegally. When these young men arrived, they didn't speak the best English and they worked as laborers. Many laborers carried cash on them, which is what gave them the term bracero, which means a laborer that always carries cash. Braceros also only refer to Mexican laborers, but these guys were migrants of different Hispanic nationalities. The Pilsen area was mostly Americanized Mexicans by the early 70s. Therefore, migrants were often picked on and bullied, or even beaten and robbed of their cash. The neighborhood gangs knew these young men carried cash on them, so they were often beaten on the street or harassed for money. These youths finally got sick of being harassed and beaten, so they decided to form a group to protect each other. The group decided to mock the slang name they were called in the neighborhood and make it their own. The group adopted the Mexican flag colors, mainly because of the Mexican members in the group and because of the neighborhood they lived in, even though many members were Central American. The Braceros were not a street gang, but more of a party crew that could assemble to fight alongside each other if need be. Using the Mexican flag as their colors angered neighborhood gangs, but they fought hard in the 70s to keep their identity. The Brazers tried to just function as a party crew, but they soon got into fights with neighborhood gangs like the Halsted Boys, the Morgan Deuces, the Cool Gang and Latin Kings. This dragged them into gang activity, but Brazers refused to use guns. They instead wanted to always fight with fists, because it was more honorable and tougher. They gained a lot of respect from the other gangs for this. In the year 1981, the Folk Alliance grew in size as more gangs were invited to join the Folk Nation or the People. This is when they joined the Folk Alliance alongside the Latin Stylers and the Black Gangster Disciples. The Black Gangster Disciples were the ones that directly took the Brazers right into the alliance at the same time as the Stylers. The Stylers were close allies with the Maniac Latin Disciples and brought the Brazers before the MLDs, taking the Brazers into the Maniac Alliance. It was perhaps at this point where the Brazers changed their colors to black and red. Brazer turf grew all around Chase Park as they now conquered along the boundaries of Ainsley Street on the north, Leland Avenue on the south, Beacon Street on the east and Paulina Street on the west. The 80s was perhaps their best years as they became a major force to be reckoned with in Uptown. They became an important part of the alliance, and along with the maniac Latin disciples, they would sometime bring hell to the Latin kings and their allies. The Brazers' move uptown and smart leadership allowed them to make more money. Just about everyone in the crew had a vehicle during their peak. They would usually ride up, hop out the cars, and give you a beating. It was rumored that they were also funded and working for the gangster disciples during this time, and gave out beatings in their name. The Brazers fought vicious gang wars with the People's Nation enemies throughout the 1980s into the 90s. They fought hard until the police and immigration cracked down on them in the mid-90s and deported many of their members. In 1996, the Brazers left Chase Park and opened operations at the intersection of Morse and Wayne in the nearby Rogers Park neighborhood because the police were on them in the Uptown neighborhood. In 1980, Los Braceros realized there was too much gunplay in Pilsen and packed up and left the area, taking more than half the gang uptown to Sunnyside and Hazel. Tarzan assumed leadership of the Brazers. Once the Braceros arrived, they changed their identity and Americanized their name more to become the Brazers. Although most Hispanic residents in Uptown were Rican, the Brazers scooped up mainly Mexican youths they found in the neighborhood as they made their way to Chase Park and left Sunnyside and Hazel. In this area, the Brazers encountered the Latin kings. They also got into it with the Gaylords, Kenmore boys and vice lords in the neighborhood as well. While encountering these enemies, the Brazers found other neighborhood gangs that had the same enemies in common, especially the Latin Stylers, Simon City Royals and the Black Gangster Disciples. At some point the Brazers went to war with fellow folks, the Spanish Cobras and Ashland Vikings. The Brazers eventually withdrew from Morse and Wayne, but possibly not until the 2010s decade. They may still be active in the area. The Ashland Vikings story begins in the year 1963 on the borderline of the East Village and Noble Square neighborhood. When Puerto Rican migration first came to this area in 1963, there was an immediate flare-up of street gangs appearing in the surrounding neighborhoods. In that year of 1963, a group of boys that lived in the area got together and played football on the grounds of Wells High School at 936 Ashland and Walton. Therefore, the earliest Viking history was not about gangs, it was only about hanging out. The Viking name did not even exist yet. It was not until 1965 that the Viking name first appeared. The teens now had a good football team and needed a name. The Ashland Vikings name was voted in over the Ashland Pirates for the name of their football team. The boys, who were also now into girls and partying, opened their first clubhouse in a basement at 921 N Ashland, just off the corner of Ashland and Walton Street. By 1967, the Ashland Viking football team were getting noticed by the surrounding street gangs. Latin kings would patrol down Ashland Avenue toward Walton Street and see the group of kids hanging out and start trouble with them. The Latin kings were mainly out on patrol looking for playboys to fight with, but would either catch the football team before or after they fought the playboys and cause trouble with them too. On other days, playboys would patrol down Ashland looking for trouble with Latin kings, and along the way they would see the football team and go after them, since they were a group of Puerto Rican kids. Then on some days it was even worse when playboys and Latin kings clashed and they each patrolled down Ashland and each of them ran down the Vikings football team. In the beginning, the football team had to run from these gangs because they didn't have the resources playboys and Latin kings had. The Latin kings began to take aggressive measures to recruit these teens into their gang, but as the boys resisted and refused to join, the LKs began to cause more and more trouble with the team until the team's leader, called Puncher, decided it was enough and converted the Ashland Viking football team into the Ashland Viking Street Gang. The Latin kings and playboys would become the Vikings' first arch enemies. Viking territory would be from Walton to Fry St. and from Ashland to Greenview Street in the Noble Square neighborhood. As a new gang, the Vikings fought in low-profile tactics which often gave them the advantage as they battled the senior Latin kings and the PVPs, Pulaski Venture playboys, out of the East Village neighborhood. Among the arsenal the Vikings would use were Molotov cocktails and homemade shotguns. As the Vikings' reputation grew, so did their territory, and Puncher was now being called the Fist of the North. This section out of Ashland and Walton would eventually be known as the Fist and be the first of 8 sections that would develop over time to eventually create the 8-point Raza star. The newly formed Vikings wore light green sweaters with a dark green band wrapped around the upper left arm. The president's sweater was a little different with 3 thin stripes on the upper left arm. Legend had it that the Vikings started as a Polish gang, not true, instead the real truth is they were a Puerto Rican gang that had 3 white members that weren't even Polish, but still, they were original members and considered true brothers within the group. By 1968, it became much tougher for the Vikings to continue using low-key tactics as their brawls with the Kings intensified. They fought viciously for their turf and were now being recognized by outside gangs. In 1969, after the Ashland Vikings had completely secured their territories, which were now from Augusta to Chicago Avenue and from Ashland to Noble Street, they adopted green and black as the official colors for their sweaters. Also, in that year the Vikings realized a group of Harrison Gents out of Beach and Ashland in Wicker Park were also at war with the Latin Kings. This created a mutual connection and partnership between the Vikings and the Gents, as they had one thing in common, which was ridding the Kings out of West Town. In 1970, Puncher moved the clubhouse to the attic of an 8-unit building owned by his father at 845 N Ashland, intersecting with Pearson Street, which was still within their territories in Noble Square. It was also during a period which some members of other groups such as the HGs, LKs and Warlords were joining the Vikings, members that would become true Vikings to the end. Also, during the early 70s the Vikings went into having some rather complex operations. As they became older, they were able to invest in their own businesses and began to operate as an organized crime group, owning some properties which included 2 storefronts that masked illegal activities. In the basement of an arcade they owned, vetted members would meet to discuss business and plan out certain operations. They were highly respected in their community because instead of extortion they operated in a favor-for-favor exchange. They protected the neighborhood and in return the neighborhood provided safe houses and storage places for illegal contraband when needed. Hence their early reputation as mobsters. Also, at that time the LSD coalition had fractured, and vice lords and black gangster disciples were in heavier turmoil than ever. This caused the BGDs to make connections with white and Hispanic gangs outside of their usual turf. As for their connection with the Vikings, it started as a business deal involving drugs and firearms. However, it would eventually lead to a more shrouded relationship as they started preforming personal and secretive hits for each other in order to evade any trace back by law enforcement. In 1974, the Vikings fell into misfortune when their members were traced to the notorious Belmont Harbor murders, involving an armed robbery scheme that went wrong and resulted in the brutal murders of 2 women. Police interrogations tripped some members up, causing the police to uncover and move in on other Viking operations. With some members going to jail and others fleeing to Puerto Rico, their businesses fell apart and their numbers dwindled. In 1975, the Vikings' relations with the BGDs became inactive as both groups were now dealing with other problems on their own side of the city. In 1976, Puncher revitalized the organization with a new section of Vikings on Walton Street. Among the new recruits came young blood. Puncher saw lots of potential in young blood and the possibilities to maybe someday make him a prince. This new section of Vikings became known as the Sons. The Sons would be the second point on the future 8-point star. In 1977, the Vikings were reorganizing very well and even revitalized their connections with the BGDs. In that year Larry Hoover officially recognized the Ashland Vikings as allies with the BGDs, and in April 1978, the Ashland Vikings were among the first groups invited to join the Folk Nation Alliance due to their history with the BGDs. In 1979, the Vikings made a connection with the Spanish Cobras and the Latin Disciples through young blood. This brought about the formation of the 3rd section for the Vikings under Maniac Ashland Vikings in the spring of 1979. It was also in that year that the SCs and LDs created a friendly divide, establishing the Maniacs and the Insane for their allies. This divide was not like the hard divide that happened in 1992. But as for the affiliation between the Vikings and the YLO, Young Latino Organization, it was the Cobras that made the true connection with the Vikings, and now with this new divide the Cobras that were hanging out with the Vikings wanted the section of Maniac Ashland Vikings to turn insane. But Puncher wanted to keep his Maniac section, so he opened up a new section under Insane Ashland Vikings, reinforcing their alignment with the Spanish Cobras. This new section came in at the end of 1979. The Maniac and Insane sections of 1979 would become 2 more points of the eventual 8-point star. Also, in 1979 Puncher would officially title Young Blood as the Chosen Prince and open a major recruiting drive for additional sections. In 1980, the recruiting campaign would bring in 4 more sections. The first of the 4 in early 1980 was called the Barbarians, which would become the 5th point on the later 8-point star. A little later in the year the 6th point was opened and called the Chosen. The 7th point came in towards the end of that summer, known as the PVs. The final point of the star, becoming the 8th section, was opened towards the end of that fall, known as the Young Vs. Now that there were 8 sections, the founder created a unit called the Raja Brachianas, which was made up of officers from the 8 sections. The founder personally oversaw this commission, while Prince Youngblood was appointed to lead the Rajas. Puncher then created and named the 8-point Raja Star, which not only represented his 8 sections, it gave them independence from the bylaws of the 6-point star, while also allowing them to still be allies and part of the Folk Nation. As far as females went, only 4 sections had girls. The Fist always had girls that participated in the club. But it was in 1978 that they were officially named the Matriarch Vikings. The Sons and Maniacs by 1981 had Ashland Vikings, and in 1982 the Barbarians also had Ashland Vikings. However, only the girls in the first section of the Fist were called Matriarch Vikings. The combination of the Vikings and the young Vs were vitally important as they could easily and together slip into rival territories to surveillance hostile grounds and bring back critical information for the missions of the Rajas. Also, in 1980 the older HGs out of Cortez and Ashland under David and an independent group of Cobras were actively hanging out with the Vikings. In that same year the Vs hooked up with Erie House at 1347 West Erie Street, who were trying to form a graffiti cleanup campaign with the West Town gangs. From there Puncher and CM and Old School LD running a section out of the Huron and Ada territories established a gang truce that would include the AVs, the LDs, La Familia and the TPs. Upset with an article where the YLOs tried to claim the alliance under their flag, the Vs and the Ds pull in the HGs and start running under their own banner, UPCI, United Patriots Creating Identity, and also wanted to run the Truce Alliance under its own flag. But Erie House wanted a name better suited to the community so that they could open lines into the Department of Neighborhoods. So as a compromise they kept the initials UPCI and added the name United People for Community Improvement. Keeping the initials UPCI allowed the older leaders to keep United Patriots Creating Identity in the streets as the true umbrella over the Gang Truce Coalition, hence the AKA in the UPCI cards. Over the next couple of months the UPCI would also include the Satan Disciples, a young section of HGs out of Bosworth and Blackhawk, a group out of Eckhart Park going under the Neutrals who, although refused to be labeled a gang, could hold their own when they had to, and periodically the involvement of some Cobras and BGDs who were affiliated with the Vikings and LDs. Erie House started dealing directly with CM and Puncher and allowed them meetings in Erie House with the other gangs when needed. The anti-graffiti campaign was successful and led to a celebration event on the Eckhart Park field grounds in Noble Square. But it was the Vs who continued to launch other projects for the communities such as replacing vaulted sidewalks, cleaning vacant lots, coordinating food and clothes drives for the shelters and helping Peabody School on closed campus for the kids. As a result, the Vikings got mentioned on the nightly news a couple of times and appeared alongside Erie House on a talk show called Common Ground. In November of that year the YLO and UPCI got invited to speak at the Latino Action Coalition convention held at Roberto Clemente High School, 1147 North Western Avenue, on issues of police discrimination. The UPCI was now slipping into a political arena and the Vikings into the roles of community activist. As many of the Cortez Gents are older and raising families by 1983, their section eventually dismantles, leaving Cortez to their younger members, who are now not part of the UPCI. Also by now tensions are starting to build as the LDs that run Huron Street continue to get embroiled with the SDs over their turf rules. As a result of the SDs and LDs' internal conflicts, the SDs are no longer attending the meetings at Erie House. The Satan Disciples and the Vikings now start bumping heads as the Vikings make it clear that they side with the Latin Disciples. At the end of 1983, the SDs get into an altercation with one of the younger Viking sections. When the Rajas receive the news, the SDs are confronted by Puncher in back of Carpenter School at 1250 West Erie, which resulted in the spokesman for the SDs getting shot. The Bosworth Gents and the Milwaukee Kings, who were not happy with the UPCI's territorial control, side with the SDs, and as 1984 rolled in the Vikings took the SDs, HGs and MKs to war. During that war some Gents would take a neutral stance as they were not in favor of the Bosworth Gents and considered the true war was between the Vikings and the Satan Disciples. In 1985, the UPCI is starting to crumble as the LDs and the BGDs are the next to drop out of the affiliated group's umbrella. As the war intensifies, the SD faction, the MKS and the HGs with no real leadership, continue to struggle with the Vikings' 8 sections and their special unit of Rajas. By strategically pacing themselves and using small units, the Vikings for the most part evaded the law, endured minimal casualties, and always caught the rivals off guard. By 1986, the MKs are no longer in the picture. The HGs can no longer stand the raids by the AVs and abandon assisting the SDs. The remaining SDs, which are now also engaged in skirmishes with the LDs, basically become scarcely seen on the streets, bringing the war with the Vikings to an end. A couple of murders pointing in the direction of the Vikings was something that the UPCI could not survive, bringing down with it the end of the Vikings UPCI, along with their inside connections. In 1987, the Satan Disciples regrouped and now saw the abandonment of the Harrison Gents as desertion and a personal disrespect to them. They now with a new grudge took the HGs and the MKs to war. During a calm period in the fall of 1988, when the Vikings were not engaged in any conflicts, Puncher the Chief grants control over to Prince Youngblood, and in 1992, the Chief comes together with the Prince and combines all sections of Ashland Vikings as one unit under the umbrella of the Cobra's insane familia, ending the first era of the Ashland Vikings and the beginning of a new one under the rule of Prince Youngblood. The SDs, Satan Disciples, started in the year 1959 by King Satan at the street corner of 15th and Talman in the North Lawndale neighborhood on Chicago's west side. They started on the east side of Douglas Park, which was not a major African American neighborhood at that time. The vast majority of North Lawndale was African American by 1959, but the last of the white element was east of the park. The Satan Disciples was founded mainly by Czechoslovakian and Polish white males. They also took in Mexican youths that made up about half the gang. In the year 1960, the Satan Disciples had already expanded their turf into the heart of Chicago's Lower West Side at 18th and California in Douglas Park, along with 14th and Washtenaw in the North Lawndale area. The original SDs fought against gangs like the Gaylords at 18th and Western, the Ambrose Gang at 18th and Throop, or the Latin Counts from 18th Street and Loomis. The Latin Kings did not have any territory or any foothold in any of the SD sections back in the earliest years of the SD's existence. Therefore, the television show Gangland was not very accurate about the Satan Disciples being formed because of the Latin Kings. This is false. The Latin Kings were not the number one reason for Satan Disciples coming together. There were larger threats from Ambrose, the Latin Counts and the Vice Lords that were much closer to Satan Disciples' territory. By 1964, Latin Kings began pushing their way into the Pilsen and Little Village neighborhoods. The Latin Kings wanted 18th Street in Pilsen and 26th Street in Little Village. This did not fly well with the gangs that had already been there. The Kings were able to set up massive territory along 26th Street, but 18th Street proved to be a major challenge for them, and that is partially credited to the Satan Disciples that held it down at 18th and California. They would eventually spread to 18th and Rockwell in the North Lawndale neighborhood to further solidify their presence and keep Latin Kings out. The Latin Kings still were able to secure territory from 21st through 31st, all through Pilsen and Little Village, but the Satan Disciples made it very hard for Kings to exist there until they turned the Coulter Counts into Coulter Kings in the late 60s, but that was all that the Latin Kings could settle in Pilsen. By 1966, the Satan Disciples had now began the 18th and Oakley chapter. The original Satan Disciples were fairly well-mannered and well-dressed and even had their own band. The only time they were not well-mannered is when they faced their enemies, and that was when the horns would come out. Speaking of horns, the idea for the baby devil with horns with pitchfork came from old comic books gang members used to read. Therefore, that was their new symbols along with an intimating name. The SDs remained a very small fighting club in the 1960s, but managed to keep all their turf except 14th and Washtenaw, but that is because efforts were needed more on 18th Street, and because that neighborhood was changing racially, which is what caused the original chapter at 15th and Tallman to close. They did lose some numbers in the later 1960s due to some members getting drafted or enlisting to serve in the Vietnam War. However, those members were replaced by younger Mexican youths, but it still stunted the SD's ability to grow larger at the time. In the year 1967, the Satan Disciples may have had slower growth for a short time on 18th due to the war, but now new territory was opened at 24th and Washtenaw when Big Aggie and Little Aggie arrived in this Marshall Square neighborhood. This would become a legendary chapter that would eventually spread up and down 24th Street between California Avenue and Western Avenue. The biggest 24th sections would become 24th and Washtenaw and 24th and Rockwell. At 24th and California, Satan Disciples and Latin Kings would clash for many years as both groups claimed this territory. At the 24th Street territory, SDs also fought the Artistics and Morgan Deuces, then later they fought 26, the Kents and Cullerton Deuces by the 1970s. In 1971 or 1972, King Satan was no longer the leader and King Canary took over leadership of the gang. It was in the early 1970s when a Satan disciple named Kingfish flipped to become a Gaylord. After he flipped, he convinced many white original Satan disciples to become Gaylords, and this began the 18th and Western Gaylords. These Gaylords started because they felt threatened with the neighborhood becoming majority Mexican. As the 1970s progressed, Pilsen and Little Village became more and more gang-infested, and the gangs became more violent. The drug trade also became a larger phenomenon once the heroin trade began on the streets by 1970. Some of the older SDs got into the drug trade, but it was not rampant at all in the organization at the time, or really in any of the organizations back then, but it was present. The Ambrose Gang and Latin Counts were gunning for complete control of Pilsen, while Latin Kings were trying to dominate Little Village entirely. Satan disciples viciously fought all these gangs, they even battled it out with the 2-6 gang when they first started in 1972. In about 1975, the Satan disciples opened new turf on the northern part of Chicago in the southern part of the West Town neighborhood. After the Gaylords left the area in the mid-1970s, the Satan disciples were just moving in around Erie and Wood and Huron and Ashland areas. In this area, they fought viciously with the Latin Kings in the area just like back in the Pilsen area and Little Village. They would also clash with the C-Notes. In 78, a significant amount of Satan disciples were now locked up in prison, including some key original members. In April 1978, the Folk and People Nation alliances were created in Statesville Prison in a meeting directed by Larry Hoover, who was the leader of the Black Gangster Disciples. The purpose of this alliance was to organize the gang wars in prison and perhaps the streets. Hoover and David Barksdale had allied themselves with the white and Latino gangs throughout the 1970s. They would aid them in their wars with the vice lords. It was rumored that the Satan disciples first encountered Barksdale's black disciples back in the 60s, and friendship was established immediately, especially since vice lords were trying to conquer everything on the west side of Douglas Park and North Lawndale. A pre-existing relationship between BGDs and BDs made for a smooth transition into the Folk Nation alliance. The SDs reluctantly unified with the 2-6s and the Ambrose gang, who also joined the Folk Nation, which brought these gangs together, not only in prison, but out on the streets as well. Before this, SDs deeply hated Ambrose and were arch enemies back in the 60s and at least a good part of the 70s, especially after the leader of the Ambrose gang, Luis Lima, shot Mark Rodriguez in the leg. He also shot Fidel Perez at the corner of 16th and Fairfield in the North Lawndale neighborhood on October 19, 1974. Sometime after this shooting, and maybe not until the Folk Nation was formed, were Ambrose and SD's allies, but definitely by the time both gangs were folks in April 1978, they became allies in the streets. Right after the SDs joined the Folk Nation, the first written constitution was drafted, thanks in part to the influence of the BGDs. The Satan disciples would now operate with bylaws to follow that laid out the proper conduct that all members must abide by. The biggest benefit of the bylaws was it permitted free enterprise, so that all members were allowed at any point in time to open legal businesses, just like how the Chicago outfit did it since the 1910s. This was definitely a major perk to being a Satan disciple. In the late 1970s, SDs opened their first piece of South Side territory outside of the Little Village and North Lawndale area at 42nd and Campbell in the Brighton Park neighborhood. From here, the Satan disciples opened more territory in Brighton Park and neighboring Gage Park and the back of the Yards, Canaryville and McKinley Park neighborhoods in the late 1970s and early 80s. In the year 1980, they allied with the Ashland Vikings and Harrison Gents in their West Town section, right at the time when the UPCI was formed. This tightened up their relations with other folks in the area. In 1980 or 1981, King Canary was no longer the leader of the SDs. Agapito King Aggie Villalobos stepped into that role. I do not know what happened to King Canary, but he was no longer in charge by 1981 is all I know. Under King Aggie, the Satan disciples opened up new territory throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s in other parts of the city, Chicagoland suburbs and other states as membership swelled into the thousands. King Aggie was able to run the organization even after he was incarcerated in 1983 for armed robbery. The Satan disciples had now opened several more sections in the heart of Chicago neighborhood and several more in Little Village. Just a quick note. I'm referring to Satan disciples hoods along 18th Street, as in the heart of Chicago neighborhood, and not in Pilsen. The truth is the Lower West Side neighborhood is divided in two sections, one is Pilsen and the other is heart of Chicago, but most people just call all of it Pilsen, which is why the SDs are often considered to be a Pilsen gang. I can respect the fact that the SDs can be considered a Pilsen gang, but being as technical as I am, the heart of Chicago neighborhood is where SD's turf is in this vicinity. The heart of Chicago consists of these boundaries: Western Avenue to Ashland, Blue Island Avenue to 16th Street, while Pilsen is Ashland Avenue to Halsted Street and Cermak Road to 16th Street. With that being said, the Satan disciples pretty much dominated the heart of Chicago neighborhood by the 1980s and even presently. Or you can say West Pilsen is mostly all run by SDs and has been ever since the Gaylords and Stone Kents left the area. Many of Pilsen gangs have tried to conquer turf west of Ashland Avenue, but are often met with bullets and beatings. This caused them to determine that their conquest just was not worth the cost. The only gang that was ever able to contend west of Ashland in this area of 18th Street were the Bishops. In the 1980s and first half of the 1990s, the SDs had spread into many Chicagoland suburbs, especially the suburb of Cicero in 1992. Bobby D and Wacko D brought the SDs to Cicero in '92. They opened up in Westmont, Downers Grove, Aurora, Bridgeview, Waukegan, West Chicago, Rockford, Kankakee, Calumet City, Berwyn, and Blue Island, just to name some. The Downers Grove, Westmont, and Romeoville suburbs only lasted from about 1987 to 1993, but for the many others listed went strong for a while, and some are still going strong today. It was at this point in time when the SDs started to make new enemies due to colonizing other neighborhoods, enemies such as the Saints, Noble Knights, 12th Street Players, TAP Boys and more Vice Lord factions. In the year 1988, the Satan Disciples converted a portion of a Bridgeport neighborhood gang called the Mighty Projects into Satan Disciples. This brought the SDs into the Bridgeport Homes Projects. Also in 1988, the Satan Disciples went to war with some of their fellow Folk Nation allies. This started a full-scale war that erupted with the 2-6s in the early part of the year. Beginning in 1982, the Satan Disciples and 2-6s were having tension between the two organizations. By 1988, both organizations erupted into an intense gang war after a series of shootings. One such shooting happened on February 29, 1988, when 4 Satan Disciples fired shots at 2-6 gang members playing basketball at Pershing and St. Louis, in the Brighton Park neighborhood. One member was killed. One of the intended targets was a 2-6 leader, according to court documents. Shortly after this war erupted, Satan Disciples went to war with 2-6 allies such as the Party People, Raza, Sin City Boys and Latin Souls. The Satan Disciples were also having intense rivalries with other folks in West Town, as their relationships with Harrison Gents and Ashland Vikings disintegrated. In the early 1990s, as the Satan Disciples grew in size and colonized more territory, they found themselves at war with more fellow Folk Nation gangs, like the Ambrose Gang, the Tutu Boys, and the Crazy Get Down Boys. In the mid-1990s, the SDs went to war with the Harrison Gents, C Notes and Milwaukee Kings. In 1995, King Aggie was released from prison, but he soon found he was not embraced by all of the SDs. Many SDs told King Aggie that he should not be the leader and that they wanted second-in-command Danny Valencia to run the Satan Disciples as the new king. In November of 1995, Danny Valencia was shot and killed. It was said that his own gang killed him, more specifically King Aggie's supporters. The hit was allegedly ordered by King Aggie himself. After that, the Satan Disciples never had another king. As the 1990s progressed, the SDs had grown into several thousands of members, becoming one of the largest street gangs in Chicago. Over time, some sections would pop up while others would close down. The reason for the closure of certain sections was due to decisions to withdraw if an area was not profitable enough or if police presence was too strong. The SDs often function in a very organized crime manner and would only leave a turf if it was more profitable to invest more in another area. Using smart business sense, they had expanded their profits, opened several legit businesses, retained original territory and opened new turf. They eventually would grow to have almost 10,000 members.
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.